Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 137 and I am the show's host, Kyle. Happy New Year to all my listeners. This is the first Foreign Policy Focus 2018, and over the New Year's break, much like over the Christmas break, there was a whole lot of news, so I want to get you all caught up on that today. A lot of Iran stuff. I know that's big, especially in the mainstream media and coming out of the White House right now, so I want to get everybody filled in on that to the best I can. For those of you who could take the time to share the show, it would really help the show to grow. Looking to start 2018 off with a bang. So, if you get out there, click the share button and tell your friends, hey, listen to this. It's pretty good and it's good information. I really appreciate it. You go to foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, the libertarianinstitute.org, or the Facebook page Libertarian Union. I was recently on two other shows I'd just like to throw out there in case you guys can't get enough of my content. I was on Don't Waste Your Hate, talking about the Israel-Palestine conflict, probably a little bit more than I got into it on this podcast so far. So if you want to hear that, go there. And then I also did a New Year's extravaganza kind of show with the rest of the guys over at the Libertarian Union, and you can find out that both of those episodes on the Libertarian Union Facebook page. Alright, so what's going on with Iran? I think that's the big question for a lot of people, because if you're just somebody who casually watches what's going on, especially coming out of the media right now, may actually seem like a somewhat believable narrative, but I think there's a lot of significant things that the media is leaving out that we need to know about. So there have been 6 days of Iranian protests so far, and I believe that means that the protests was started in Iran on the 27th, although reporting in the West started mostly on the 28th. The original protesting was mostly over some economic issues. They were mostly referred to as economic protests. And there seem to be two main causes. One is the general inflation, and with rising prices, I guess this is something that maybe people in the United States haven't experienced because our, official inflation rate is somewhere around 2%. But if your, prices are going up noticeably every month, if you're paying an extra quarter for a loaf of bread or an extra 50 cents for a gallon of milk, this is something that people are going to take notice to, and it's going to upset people. But there was also a lot of people upset about some private banks closing. And what it sounds like happened is that for whatever reason, the people had their money either invested with or somehow tied in with these banks. And the banks kind of closed up and just left and took the assets with them. I'm guessing that the people who owned the banks probably had connections to the government. And there was a lot of cronyism going on there. So this, really upset some people. And so they went out and protest. Most of these protests, while they, claimed by the Western media to be major protests and were captured by the Western media right away, didn't really seem all that large when you look at the videos on Twitter. I would say maybe like 50 to 300 people in most of the protest. Either on the same day, it's hard to tell the timeline on all of this, but around the same time there was also a pipeline bombing at a somewhat major oil pipeline for Iran in southern Iran. And we had a jihadist group taking responsibility for those bombings. That jihadist group has prior links to the Israeli equivalent of the CIA, and that is Mossad, who had hired this particular group to carry out assassinations by Iranian scientists in the past. Pretty immediately, the United States responds favorably to the protests and gives, their support to them and condemns the regime for cracking down on them. By the second day of the protest, and I'm not sure, and so I don't want to say for sure if not there was any violence associated with the first day of protest, but definitely by the second day of protest we see some violence. The violence seems to be aimed at government sites, and one of the possible ways that these protests and violence in the protests are being directed is through the Telegram app, I believe, or it might be Telegraph. Either way, this is a messaging app that I guess is pretty popular in Iran. One of the channels for the app that was in Farsi was advocating protesters to go out with Molotov cocktails and I believe throw them at police. Initially, I guess the Iranian government contacted the Telegram app, asked them if they could possibly turn off this thing. The app did respond and agree to turn it off, saying it violated terms of use because it was advocating violence. Kind of a quick sidebar side note thing. One thing I always find funny is all these apps ban people for advocating violence because some 13-year-old on Facebook is saying, I want to kill you to some other kid. There's no real threat of violence there. But at the same time, we have, Trump who will routinely tweet that he, wants a certain area to be bombed. Certainly the way he has talked about North Korea, promising fire and fury, and that's never questioned in these on these messaging sites. Certainly, if you look at the Pentagon has tons of Twitter pages. It'd be worth checking it out. I wonder if anybody's ever done research into this, into how it affects the analytics, because if you notice, they always retweet and like each other's tweets and stuff like this, and they have so many accounts. They have a Navy account, they have a 7th Fleet account, they have a fleet account for the different aircraft carriers, for the different Army brigades. And so it would really be interesting if maybe the Pentagon's found a way to inflate their impressions on Twitter and on Facebook by liking and sharing all of each other's posts and stuff like that. But anyways, like I said, these messaging sites are never at least willing, if not even, they just don't care enough to put government officials and hold government officials to the same priority as a general citizen. Now, in response to the violent protests, and even maybe the regular protests, the Iranian government has responded with some force. I've seen plenty of videos of them using tear gas and other, types of non-lethal rounds, but 21 people have been killed in the protest. It is worth noting that I believe 5 of those people are Iranian police, so it's not quite clear that it's only the police, carrying out violence against the protesters. And so, while I don't agree with the Iranian police killing people, I do think it's important to note that some of them have died as well. Iran also restricted the internet and I believe blocked access to some social media sites and messaging apps. Now, from my understanding, it's pretty easy to get around these government blots. And I remember being in high school and, figuring out how to get on Facebook by typing in like HTTPY or something, something ridiculous like that to get around the school blot. So I'm sure it wasn't super effective, the blocking of the internet in Iran, but, again, they were able to provoke some overreach from the Iranian government and, crack down on their own citizens. There was also this, thing that happened where I believe after the first day of protesting on the 27th, then on the 28th, there was a scheduled rally from the government that was supposed to be a big turnout rally from when the government defeated the 2009 protest. Of course, those 2009 protests had been routinely brought up by the Trump administration during this time, saying that too bad the Obama administration was so weak and didn't capitalize and insist on the major protests going on then. And if you go back, those were huge protests. I believe it was after the election in 2009 and Ahmadinejad had relatively stole the election there. And so people were pretty upset, took to the streets, stormed the capital of Tehran. And, it looked like hundreds of thousands, if not, close to 1 million people, out in protest in Iran at that time. And so those protests being overcome and the Iranian state surviving, they hold a rally on the 28th. That rally was huge. And I think a lot of originally the mainstream media covered it as, well, the Iranians are forcing all their civilians to come out and counter the other, protests. And in fact, some people even initially reported it as anti-government protesting. So, I don't think it's a big deal necessarily that a whole bunch of people turn out in Tehran in support of the government, just because I'm sure a lot of people there are, first of all, connected to the government. And so while their government may be doing terrible things, it's pretty easy to overlook those terrible things if it's making you really wealthy. Also, people may, be afraid to not go. You don't want to be the only person on your block to not go because then they whisper. And it's a little ridiculous that I have to qualify this statement, but I like to qualify this statement by saying I'm not calling for the overthrow of the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime is repressive, especially the hard right Ayatollah IRGC portion of the Iranian state. And, I'm sure they round up people and execute people who don't deserve it. Of course, that happens in the United States as well. So maybe it's not for political reasons, but, certainly marijuana and false conviction. Anyways, I thought the media coverage of this was pretty bad. They'll just, them not even looking into the Iranian calendar, saying that these were forced by the government at the last minute, when really they were planning months in advance and before the other protests broke out. Some notable things about what's going on right now in Iran, and I think these are just things that are notable because we don't have either answers to them or because there's something that you would think you would see if these were protests as portrayed by the Trump administration and by the U.S. mainstream media as something that are really significant and in a good direction and grassroots. The first is that hasn't really been any protesting in Tehran. If you go back to 2009, protesting in Tehran was huge. And so it at least suggests that whatever is going on right now in Iran isn't as popular as the '09 protests, but that doesn't mean, they can't get there one day. There was a huge lack of Twitter activity in Farsi related to the hashtag Iranian Protests, that I guess was the hashtag that everybody was using about the protests. Now, in all fairness, this could have something to do with the government blocking some of the internet, but like I talked about before, it's pretty easy to get around that, and it seems like people really weren't stopped by that. We also now have the Iranian government backing off on the blocking of those sites, and we have the president of Iran, Rouhani, announcing that they weren't going to, violently suppress peaceful protesters as well. However, I guess most of the tweets were in Arabic and from Saudi Arabia, and not from Iran, and in, the Iranian Persian Farsi language. So, that seems to be that while this is something that, the mainstream media points to and say, oh, look how popular this is on Twitter, that a lot of the Twitter activity isn't going on in Iran. We have the U.S. response, and as I talked about, it's been supporting the protests, but it's going further than that. Trump is personally calling on and supporting the protesters. He is encouraging them, and he is demanding that the, Iranian government not respond with violence. However, one of the problems for the Iranian government is that some of the protesters are violent. And so while, it creates a real problem for the Iranian state, and I'm not trying to give them advice on how to solve it or anything, but if the protesters are trying to burn down government buildings, the Iranian regime probably feels they can't let that happen. And also, there may be people that get hurt by protesters being violent. So, maybe the Iranian regime police will try to focus on just taking out the violent protesters. However, any use of violence by the Iranian police will receive international criticism. We're seeing Nikki Haley, U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, having a very strong take on this. Haley, I believe, is calling for an emergency UN meeting, I guess, trying to garner international support and enforce UN sanctions on Iran over the protesting. One thing we may see is that in the coming days, I believe the first date is the 12th, so 10 days from now, the Trump administration will have to, re-give waivers to Iran to keep off the nuclear sanctions. I see it as being unlikely at this point that Trump then goes through and signs these waivers if he continues with the hostilities that he currently has against the Iranian government. And so I think this is the big problem. For those of you who listen to the show a lot, I'm a non-interventionist. I don't think the U.S. should be going around and supporting, different protest groups or whatever. What's going on in Iran is extremely complex. And so it could very likely be a situation like in Syria where there's a large peaceful protest movement. However, there's jihadist factions embedded within that protest movement who look to capitalize on the chaos created by it and in the international community. And will look to capitalize by gaining support from the international community for the, quote unquote, peaceful protesters. But, it'll really just go to benefit the most extreme factions of them. And so by the U.S. getting involved, I think we could see another situation like that in Iran, and that's really scary. For the most part, the mainstream media has come out in full support of the protesters. And as far as the protesting is peaceful and for, a more free Iran, I more or less support that. I don't want the people of Iran to be repressed or anything like that. However, I think it's important that the media do a good and diligent job of trying to cover this in the least biased way possible. And by repeating the statements of the Trump administration all day long and just covering the real idea that, there are there are violent protesters who are targeting the police, and some of the people dying are police. That's a real thing. And then also too, right now, you gotta look at the, other half, maybe the other side of the Middle East, on Israel and Palestine, where the Palestinians have protested for days and the Israeli government has cracked down at least as hard as the Iranian government on protesters. I've seen several well-documented instances right now in Israel where you have, people who are absolutely unarmed being killed. You have the 16-year-old Ahed Talimimi, who is a young girl who had some Israeli soldiers on her family's property, and they shot her young cousin in the face with a rubber bullet. I believe he went into a coma, and, That's a real tragedy. And she bats them off of her family's property, yelling at them in their face. And then they come in the middle of the night and they arrest this little girl. And I mean, look, if anybody looks at a picture of this little girl, you'll pretty know, like, she may be fierce and she has a lot of spirit. But at the end of the day, one of these Israeli soldiers could have knocked her on her ass, barely swinging his fist. And so to pretend like she was any kind of threat to the soldiers is absolutely ridiculous. But now, after being held for at least 3 weeks, finally gets charged and I believe has like 12 counts against her is absolutely absurd. And so for the U.S. mainstream media not to cover this, but then to go around and cover what's going on only in Iran is simply dishonest and absolutely biased. You have some pretty good coverage in the alternative media. I'll point out 2 sources. Dan McAdams and Ron Paul on the Ron Paul Liberty Report did a very good job of covering this on today's show. I'll link to that in the show notes page. And then Moon of Alabama is doing a good job of covering this. Be There has already posted, I believe, 3 articles. I'll post the most recent. If the mainstream media was doing their job, a couple of questions I would just like them with their massive amount of resources to go and try to figure out is who's behind, the encouragement and the accounts encouraging, the people to, do violent protesting. Who are the violent protesters? Are they people trying to exploit the peaceful protesting? And then also just trying to figure out, go interview some Iranian people who are, legitimately protesting, ask them what they're mad about, because it doesn't seem like I'm seeing very many of those interviews and many more of the John Bolton types in the United States going, the Iranian regime is really evil and we gotta stand up to him because all we do is stand up for evil, against evil. Another question I have is, what does the U.S. want out of this situation? Why is the Trump administration pressing so hard to demonize Iran here? Couple possibilities could be to, have a good out for the Iran nuclear deal. Like I said, some pretty important dates for that coming up the 12th and the 17th of this month. Or you could be looking at the United States trying to get a UN resolution for absolute and complete regime change in Iran. Of course, this would be an utter mess. I mean, the Iranian military is strong, and large and very powerful factions of that military are controlled by the Iranian hardliners and are more loyal to the Ayatollah than they would be to any U.S., maybe Sunni government that they try to support and impose on the Persian people. And so, if this does turn to full-scale regime change, I would expect for it to be extremely ugly. Alright, so that's what I have for Iran now. I'm sure in the coming shows that there's going to be nearly a daily update on what's going on with these protests until they either fizzle out or turn into an all-out war. So we'll see what happens. Some North Korea stuff. On New Year's Eve, or New Year's Day, we have Kim Jong-un giving a statement. The most important thing from this statement is that Kim Jong-un said he would like to send a delegation of North Korean athletes to the Olympics and would like to have talks with the South Korean government about that. And the whole world should have stood up and applauded and been so happy that, this was the great accomplishment of New Year's Day 2018. However, in another portion of that statement, Kim Jong-un said that the nuclear button was on his desk at all times. Now, obviously that statement is not extremely literal. I'm sure that there's not a big red button on Kim Jong-un's desk that one day he's going to put his finger on and a nuclear weapon will go off. I'm also sure that they don't keep the nuclear button on the top shelf in the back closet. That way, Kim Jong-un, it takes him 15 minutes to find it. I'm sure it's a very similar situation to what they have in the United States, where some guy follows Trump around with a briefcase, and in it there's the necessary equipment for him to order the launch of the nuclear weapons. Right? Like, everybody knows this. This is, common fact. However, this is all the mainstream media capitalizes on. This is every AP tweet, every CNN article, every Fox article. This is all people are talking about. What Kim Jong-un was doing was reasserting his nuclear deterrence, and that's what North Korea has been doing this whole time, trying to achieve a nuclear deterrent. What Kim Jong-un wants to be able to do is say to the United States, you can't attack me, you can't regime change me, because if you do, I will nuke the United States. This North Korea, I think, took the lesson from the USSR and saw that this is what prevented the United States from attacking them. And this is what North Korea's foreign policy strategy is and has been. And that, sounds much more reasonable than, North Korea. Kim Jong-un sits there all day with a big red button with a skull and crossbones on it, inching his finger towards it about to hit like the US mainstream media likes to pretend. So this is great. The funny thing about this is that the U.S. government is being circumvented for these talks. Of course, the United States refuses to talk to North Korea unless North Korea gives into all the U.S. demands off the top. The Intercept released a pretty good story about Facebook. I believe Glenn Greenwald himself wrote it. But basically what he did is detailed that if a person receives sanctions from the United States, that person can no longer have a Facebook account. Facebook said this is in compliance with U.S. sanctions law. I would be interested to know if other social media accounts and then other, U.S. or Microsoft, allow people to use Skype if they're on the sanctions list. So these are good questions to ask, but I think this is a big deal and shows why sanctions may be even more significant. If you look at a situation in Iran right now, or even anywhere in the Middle East where social media is a huge source that people use to rally and organize protesting, if half the people are barred from using these platforms and therefore cannot get their message out, I'm not saying that everybody sanctioned by the United States is a great person who should have their message heard. However, it's just, further showing that, without the United States actually putting boots on the ground, they could really affect the situation on the ground in these countries. An update on the story of the Rohingya. Of course, these are the people that live in northwest Myanmar and were attacked by the Buddhist government there, forced many of them into Bangladesh. Now in one of these Bangladesh refugee camps, there's a shortage of diphtheria meds. Diphtheria is a very dangerous, I believe, lung infection that kills a lot of people. And there's an outbreak that have Yemen right now too, which is concerning because if there's a shortage of those meds in both places, it's going to mean it's, going to be hard to get them to either place. Pakistan, we have a U.S. drone strike being carried out in Pakistan claiming to kill somebody in the Taliban leadership. We have the United States threatening to cut aid to Pakistan. Of course, Pakistan doesn't have a whole lot of control of the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, and that's because not everybody agrees to the border. And there are tribes of people that live on the border and have lived on the border for years, way before the line was ever drawn. And so, there's really nothing you can do. You can't draw a line through the middle of Pashtunistan and force any, army to really be able to enforce it. So I know the Pakistani government was building a border fence. I'm sure, unfortunately, all the border fence is going to do is split, tribes and families who live on opposite sides of the fence. Honest people who aren't willing to try to dig under the fence because, it's not worth it for them. However, the border is just so unmanageable and the terrain is just so unfriendly that, of course, people who are already operating outside the law are going to exploit it and go through it and will be just fine. In Afghanistan, we had what looks like a remote bombing at a funeral, killing 18 people. Afghanistan has been an absolute bloodbath in the past year, and it's just so horrific. The other big bloodbath in the world right now is Yemen, where Saudi Arabia is just slaughtering people. I don't know how else to say it. There are some people trying to enjoy an evening out in Hodeidah at a restaurant, and they were all killed by a Saudi airstrike. Apparently, this was a very popular restaurant. And so, absolute tragedy that all these people died. It's over the holidays for us, and I'm sure, around New Year's, people there celebrate too. And for a Yemeni citizen who maybe lives in fear every single day of being, their house the one hit by a Saudi airstrike. In fact, I saw a Yemeni journalist tweet on Twitter that his neighbor's house had been hit by an airstrike, and luckily the bomb didn't explode. And so the reality in Yemen is that any day your house could be the one to explode. But you take the chance on New Year's to take the wife and the kids out and have a nice meal, and now you're dead. So some bleak news today at the end, but some good stuff with North Korea. I hope everybody could take the time to share this show. There's a lot of important information here that people aren't hearing other places. If you turn on Fox News, you're not going to hear this kind of in-depth analysis on the Iran issue. You're just going to hear John Bolton saying, well, too bad Obama was weak, or this would have been done in 2009. So foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. The podcast is on iTunes and Stitcher, libertarianinstitute.org. Libertarian Union on Facebook, at KYAAALE on Twitter. The personal website is kylesfilesball.com. Thanks, everyone.